Okay, let's keep reading Aussie Chomp's Grommet Saves the World. We're up to chapter 8. I wasn't quite sure whether it was easier having Max Fegan as an enemy or a friend. He was a sort of suspect after all, because he was close mates with Mr. LaRousse. Could I trust him? This is the big question that undercover agents ask all the time. I have seen enough movies to know that if they get the answer wrong, they can end up as roadkill. The days passed. I discovered that Mr. Roos ate a hamburger for lunch every day, the same type, bought at the same place at the same time. He drove a genuine bone-rattling Land Rover, not one of those pampered four-wheel drives with stereo CD players and air conditioning. Wherever he went, he left an odour, a mixture of straw and animal fur, and the odd whiff of something more earthy. But I couldn't find the evidence that showed he was the saboteur. At least there were no more accidents. Then disaster. It wasn't sabotage, not the type I was hunting for, and it didn't even happen inside the park. No, it began in my own home. I came home exhausted after a whole day on the knife edge as an undercover agent, and as I stepped through the front door, my little brother tackled me. Brett is only 7, and usually when he tries to tackle me, he bounces off. This time I ended up on my face, eating carpet. "We're going to Scream World," he shouted in my car. "Who?" "Tessa and me. Mum and Dad are taking us." Tessa is 10 and doesn't play footy. However, she certainly knows how to sink the boot in. "It's because we've been good all holidays," she said from the end of the hall. The message was obvious. I hadn't managed to be good all holidays, so I wasn't invited. In fact, I was banned from having fun for the rest of my life. Mum appeared in the doorway behind Tessa. She looked a little guilty, but it was true. "But you can't go to Scream World," I yelled at them. This was the last thing I needed. Undercover agents are useless once their cover is blown. Unfortunately, my parents thought I had other motives for injecting. "It serves you right," said Mum. "Let this be a lesson to you." "No, you don't understand." I was desperate and began clutching at any excuse I could think of. "It's too expensive." "Not tomorrow. Look, it's free." Dad held up the newspaper showing a large advertisement. "Open day at Scream World." I had heard Miss Walters and Ben Toppler arguing about this. Ben was against the idea. A waste of money, he called it. They had lost enough already since the accident started. Mrs. Walters insisted. They needed people to come and see how much fun it all was, and how safe. She had invited the television stations to come along and film the crowds. I argued with my parents even harder than Ben Toppler had argued with Mrs. Walters. Both of us lost. "It's just sour grapes," my father told me. Just sour grapes. Tessa poked her tongue out at me. Brett looked like he would tackle me again, so I told him what I'd do if he tried. He didn't. I lay awake all night wondering how I was going to avoid them and still do my job. Nothing cropped up to let me sleep easily. Then, 3 minutes after I walked into Scream World, I found the answer, or at least it found me. I was watching for my parents when a large furry thing bumped into me. "Oh, sorry," said a kangaroo. I'm not crazy. I knew kangaroos can't talk. This was a life-size character from the cartoons on television. The head came off the body, and I found myself staring at a boy about 16. "Phew, it's hot in here. I'm going to die." It took about 3 minutes to convince him to let me take his place. "What are you going to do in this thing anyway?" he wanted to know. "Play tricks on my friends? Come on, you're melting. If you let me switch with you, you can have fun all day and still get paid at the end for being a kangaroo." "Not unless I'm wearing that suit at 5 o'clock, he said, and I knew from the look on his face that he was seriously thinking about it. All right, I'll meet you back here at 4:30. He was sold. Now I was a kangaroo, and a very hot one at that. After half an hour I was beginning to understand what a lobster feels like when it's dropped into hot water. I ripped a hole in the seams under each armpit for a bit of cross-ventilation, and that brought the temperature down a few degrees. The shade of the fake rainforest was very was very inviting, but I had to move around to have any chance of stopping the sabotage. There were some definite benefits to being a furry animal as well. A Japanese woman gave me the biggest hug, and for the moment I thought I would get the same from three absolute babes. Instead, they took turns standing beside me while the third one snapped a photo. Perhaps this was a sign that my luck was turning south. The bulky suit made me awkward when people crowded around, and to make matters worse, it had a joey in its pouch. I knocked over three little kids and a grandma before I learned how not to turn around suddenly. Then a cute little girl tried to tug the poor joey right out of its pouch. "Help! Someone's trying to take my baby," I shouted. It was just a joke. A real kangaroo would have given her a good kick, but the girl started to cry and her mother told me off. This day wasn't going well, and before much longer, it was going to get a lot worse. What's that? Chapter 9. Chapter 9. I wondered whether I should let Max know I was in disguise. He had been good to me after my friends had stolen the handbag. In fact, the last few days we'd developed a respect for each other. I might even admit that I liked him, though not to his face. Then, yesterday, when I followed Mr. LaRousse on his lunch break, who should turn up to have a burger with him but Max Fegan? They sat together for 20 minutes, deep in serious discussion. I could just hear the robot sounds coming from the little amplifier. Mountain was definitely one of the words. That could only mean mountain of terror. But were they talking about the safety rail from 2 weeks ago, or what they intended to do next? It was Max himself who told me of the importance of solid evidence and not just suspicions. A good undercover agent has to be daring but also cautious. I wouldn't tell Max just yet. But if no one knew I had been a kangaroo all day, Miss Walters might think I had cheated on our deal and gone surfing instead. So I went to see her. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Walters, it is in a meeting right now. It's important. So is this meeting. The owners have come to see her. I can hardly barge in and say there's a kangaroo waiting to see her, can I?" I put my head back on and walked out into the sunshine. Just as well, my face was hidden because Ben Toppler, the assistant manager, was hurrying up the stairs. If he'd recognised me from the Lethal Looper, I would have had to explain my special role as an undercover agent. My kangaroo suit wasn't made for easy walking. Even old grannies on walking frames raced past me like I was standing still. At least I had plenty of time to observe the crowd. To my surprise, Ben Toppler passed me again, going in the same direction this time and sticking to the edge of the wide streets where he could move faster. I knew the park like the back of my furry paw by now, and I guessed he was heading for the Panther Prowl. Mrs. Walters had persuaded not just one but 3 television stations to send their cameras along. I'd seen tripods and microphones being set up earlier, and Ben Toppler had been buzzing around asking if they needed anything. "Keep your eyes peeled on those panthers," he'd insisted. It's a strange thing about television cameras. Set one up and people will come from all around, expecting something exciting will happen. A large crowd had gathered, including Mum and Dad and Tessa and Brett. I was so busy avoiding them that I almost bumped into Toppler. This time, he hadn't joined the cameraman and the pretty reporter with the microphone in her hand. He had stopped near the lane that led to the back of the enclosure and was looking at something some distance away, something high off the ground. I turned to see what it was, but at first I was baffled. No birds, no low-flying planes, just a pole with one of Max's cameras on top. While I was watching the camera, it moved to a new position. When I turned back to where Toppler was standing, he was gone. It took a moment to find him. He had slipped down the service road towards the rear of the enclosure. He's going to see Mr. LaRousse, I decided. On a day like today, it was important to have the Panthers looking good and doing whatever Panthers do. Well, that wasn't my job. Time to get back to the world of an undercover agent. I took a step backwards, but for some reason my eye stayed on Toppler as he hurried down the tree-lined lane. What I saw in the next few seconds changed everything. He was about to open the staff-only door when he sprang back suddenly, looked around frantically, then ducked behind a row of wheelie bins. Moments later, the door opened and Mr. LaRousse marched out. He didn't notice Toppler behind the bins. In 20 purposeful strides, he reached the corner where I stood. Of course, LaRousse didn't know it was me, but he still managed to glare at the outfit with a look that said, "What a fool! Who would walk around dressed like a silly kangaroo for a living?" I didn't have time to see where LaRousse went after that. Suddenly, it had become more important to watch Toppler, who, glancing over his shoulder, pushed his way carefully inside the panther prowl. What are we up to? Chapter 10. Chapter 10. Should I follow Toppler or not? Oh, what the heck. I've been banned from plenty of places and it hasn't stopped me yet. The only problem was getting through the doorway. My big round rhubarb was too wide, so it was time to become just plain old Grommet again. The cool air of the darkened space chilled the perspiration that had already soaked my skin. My shirt. Family or no family, I wasn't going back into that outfit again. Where was Toppler? I crept forward, staying in the shadows close to the walls. There was someone ahead, but I couldn't tell whether it was him or not. At last the figure came towards me, into the brightness under the skylight, and I saw it was the woman who told me about LaRousse and the lion. Her mind was on her job, not intruders. She turned into the storeroom I had seen on my earlier visit. No sooner did she step inside than someone sprang out of the darkness and slammed the door behind her. Before she knew what had happened, he'd locked the door and shoved the key in his pocket. She banged against it with her fists and shouted, but no one could hear her. No one but me. What type of sabotage did Toppler have in mind this time? I tracked his movements through the shadows until I heard the large refrigerator open and close. Under the skylight, I caught a glimpse of what he held in his hands. Meat. 5, 6 large hunks of it. He dropped one hunk at his feet and threw 2 back towards the gates that led into the enclosure. The rest he used to make a trail all the way to the door that led out into the lane. Then he pulled the door open and jammed a piece of wood in place to keep the door open. What should I do? Without a key, I couldn't get the woman out of the storeroom. As soon as he moved back towards the gates, I could run for help, but I wasn't sure where Max was. Even if he was in his office, that was on the other side of the screen world. Through a crowd like today's, it would take 7, maybe 10 minutes to reach him and another 10 to run back. By then, Toppler would have released the Panthers. Someone could get hurt. My family was out there. It might be one of them. What could Max and his men do anyway? They would have to shoot the Panthers. Miss Walters, Mr. LaRousse, even Max himself would lose their jobs. Toppler had gone towards the gates into the enclosure. I hurried to the door and he had propped open and kicked away the piece of wood. Idiot! Why didn't I pull it away slowly with my hand? The wood scraped loudly across the concrete, surprising me, and in that instant I let go of the door. If the original noise wasn't enough to alert Toppler, the sound of that door slamming certainly was. "Who's there?" he hissed. I tried to hide, but in a matter of seconds he'd found me. He'd lunged at me, but I'm a real weed, remember, a whippet, and I slipped under his arm. Unfortunately, he was between me and the door, so true escape wasn't just an option yet. In fact, there wasn't much space to get around in, and I wasn't keen on going too close to the gate of the enclosure. Once he grabbed me, I didn't stand a chance. He was much stronger than me. I needed something to even up the score, a weapon of some kind, but the best I could find was a broom. When he came at me, I shoved the coarse bristles in his face. This was just enough to make Toppler back away, but then it was his turn to hunt for weapons, and unlike mine, his luck was in. He reached up and took a rifle from a special harness on the wall. In the dim light, that was all I could see. He raised it to his shoulder, his finger on the trigger. This was going to be my last moment alive on planet Earth, and when that happens, you say some strange things like, "Hey, I'm only 13, you can't kill me like this, I'd rather do community service." Maybe I fainted for a second or two. Maybe I tried to jump away at the last minute. Thwack! Something hit the wall beside my shoulder. A dart. This gun shot only tranquilizer darts, and not very accurately, it seemed. He was loading another dart into the rifle. Time to go. I couldn't get past him. I would have to go over him. To my right, the wall was made of massive boulders, part of the enclosure itself. I climbed as quickly as I could, just getting high enough before Toppler's grasping hand snatched at my heels. He went back to loading the gun. I kept climbing. Right now, my skinny little bottom was making the perfect target. My arms ached, my feet struggled to find a foothold. I don't know how I did it, but suddenly I was on top of the wall. Sunlight beat down on me as though I had stepped into the spotlight on a stage. Where was I? What was on the other side of this rock wall? A noise reached my ears, and suddenly I knew, without needing to look, down, panthers. 1, 2, no, 3. And that one in the shadows makes 4. I lost count after that. I turned back, looking down towards Toppler. He had the gun raised to his shoulder again. My next movement was all instinct. After all, who would just stand there and let a guy shoot a tranquilizer dart into his leg or stomach? I jumped out of the way, didn't I? The only trouble was there was only one way to jump. Chapter 11. As falls go, I've had worse. No bones were broken, and the only blood on show came from the grazes on my palms, but I had more to worry about than the dull pain in my hands. It was a spectacular entrance, I have to admit, and the panthers weren't likely to miss it. They simply stared at me at first as though I had dropped in for lunch unexpectedly. Maybe I had. This gave me a minute to look around. Whoever built the enormous rock wall behind me had made sure that from this side no one, man or panther, was going to climb it. It was a cliff face with no spaces for hands or feet or paws to get a hold. Scratch one method of escape. On my left was the wide ditch that separated the enclosure from the gaping crowd. There was a lot of extra gaping going on right now. I wished I was with them, watching some other poor fool get torn apart by panthers. At least my death would be recorded on film, a sort of action replay for my family. There they were, Mum and Dad looking as stunned as the rest, though Tessa and Brett were probably saying I'd planned this to embarrass them. I didn't think it was the moment to wave. One of the panthers started towards me, slowly, with real stealth, like I was an antelope caught alone on the African plains. I'd never watch another wildlife program again. A second and then a third big cat decided to take a look. Before I knew it, I had 5 panthers closing in, all timing their movements to arrive at the same time. Maybe it's bad manners among panthers to start eating before everyone else. I felt the wall hard against my back. Across the ditch, a horrified scream rang out. "Help him, someone!" But the ditch kept people out as well as panthers in. Not even an Olympic long jumper would get across. I thought about my funeral again and wondered if there would be anything left to bury. "Don't move," said a familiar voice, although it wasn't a voice I was fond of. The robot squawk of Mr. LaRousse was talking to me. "Whatever you do, don't run. They'll know you are a prey then, and they'll rip your throat out in seconds." Where was he? I dared a glance towards the ditch. No sign of him. I checked the other way, and there he was, in the enclosure with me. One hand holding his amplifier in place, the other hand gripping round the handle of a whip. "Stay where you are. I'll drive them off." He edged his way cautiously across the grass in a wide half circle until he was between me and the panthers. The first crack of the whip made me jump more than the big cats. At least he had their attention, and that meant they might forget about me. This was no time for heroic plans of my own. He told me to stay where I was, and that's what I did. Slowly he began to force them back, but they were spread widely in front of him, and as soon as he advanced on one side, the others would try and slip round him, and he had to turn quickly, latching at them. They hissed and growled at him, turning my guts to marshmallows, but they were afraid of that whip and Mr. LaRousse's harsh mechanical voice. It kept working, step by step, metre by metre. He made them retreat, even the biggest one on his right, which gave out a frightening high-pitched snarl every time he cracked the whip. Further. I think I managed to breathe again. About then, they were 20 metres away. 25. Phew. I wasn't going to be a grommet steak after all. At that moment, a second keeper rushed into the enclosure. I'm sure it was a very brave thing to do, and all he wanted was to rescue me. But I wish he'd left all that to Mr. LaRousse. The clang of the gate opening and closing distracted the panthers. They forgot the whip and ran off in every direction, most of them as far away from me as possible. I was pleased about that. Unfortunately, one of them started back towards me, the big one, the noisy one. Just my luck. He was probably the hungriest. Was it any less painful to be mauled by one panther than 5? "Grommet! Grommet!" This was no metal voice from a machine. It was a commanding male voice, strong but with a touch of anxious concern about it. And it was just how I imagined God's voice would be. It was coming from above me. Oh no, what next? Would my whole life flash before my eyes? As the huge black beast munched through my body, was my soul going to float up and away to join that voice? Grommet, here, grab this! Something touched my hand, then dangled before my eyes. A rope, and that voice. Max! Looking up, I found him at the top of the wall, in exactly the spot where I'd stood before I jumped. Grab the rope, he said again. My hands were a mess of scratches that stung like fire when I took hold. How could I climb to safety? One look at the advancing panther changed my mind. I planted my foot against the rock wall and started hand over hand. After a few moments, I was horizontal, but it was hard work and much, much too slow. The cat was almost on me. Thump! The rope was tugged hard from above me, and I lost my footing on the rocks. Fear saved me. It locked my hands around that rope as Max hauled me with his restless strength. I felt myself rising quickly, my feet dangling free. How high was I? More importantly, was I high enough? I looked down, and that was a very silly thing to do. Much too close below me was that huge panther. I was certain it had doubled in size in the last 10 seconds. It leapt up at me and only missed taking off my leg at the knee because I jerked sideways. Hurry, Max! He was pulling with all his might, and up I went. 2 quick tugs, maybe a metre closer to the top. The panther sprang after me again, and I felt a sharp pain on the sole of my foot, but Max kept pulling before it could have another go. I was too high for it to reach me, as long as I didn't slip back anyway. Poor Max. He was grunting and swearing, but he wouldn't let go. 3 metres, 2, 1, then I could get my arm up over the top of the wall. Safe at last. I sat up and pulled off my shoe. There was a thin line of blood tinging the grubby white of my socks. When I looked at the shoe, there was a neat slash through the rubber sole, 7 centimetres long. Chapter 12. When I explained what had happened, Max handed Ben Toppler over to the police. Later, Toppler confessed to causing all of the accidents. The fire in the ghost train, the safety rail on the Mountain of Terror, and it was him I'd seen disappearing through the hedge near the Lethal Looper. Why, they asked him. Wouldn't you know it? He was a kind of undercover agent himself, except that he was working against Scream World. Some shady business types had offered him a bunch of cash to make the place look bad. Once it was closed down, these crooks were going to buy up the land, build luxury houses on it, and sell them off for $1 squillion. How warped is that? If you ask me, the world doesn't need any more luxury houses. It needs more fun places like Scream World. Of course, before I found all this out, I had to face the television cameras. I wasn't the hero this time. That honour belonged to Max and Mr. LaRousse, who had rescued me, especially Mr. LaRousse, who had run out into the enclosure and driven off most of the panthers. What happened? The pretty reporter asked breathlessly. Was this another accident? I was all set to tell the truth, but when she asked this question, I hesitated. If I told them that the assistant manager had tried to let the panthers loose, Scream World would be done for. No one would dare come here any more. It was a stunt, I said. No one looked more surprised than Mrs. Walters, who was standing close by. I winked at Max, who was clever for a security guard. He knew what I was doing. Yes, we wanted to put on a show for you all, didn't we, Ted? Mr. LaRousse was a shy man, and he didn't want to use his amplifier in front of the camera. He just nodded. Well, we were certainly fooled, said the reporter, smiling now to show her brilliant white teeth. Hundreds of people were gathered round. They started to clap. They were still clapping when my family pushed their way through the crowd. Mum and Dad didn't quite know what to say. Mrs. Walters was smiling and saying what a great guy I was. Max had his hand on my shoulder, like I was his best mate. Even Mr. LaRousse had a crooked smile on his crooked lips. We had found the saboteur, and with my face about to go out on every television station in the country, my life as an undercover agent was well and truly over. I would have to go back to being a 13-year-old grommet. I wasn't sure that it was going to be as much fun as it had been before. After all, my mates had turned against me, and come to think of it, I didn't really want them as mates anymore. From now on, being grommet would have to be more than just wearing my cap backwards and pulling crazy moves on my skateboard. I felt a bit uneasy about that. Then, excuse me, said a voice. I turned around to see a man with tanned skin, gangster sunglasses and a heavy gold chain around his neck. He came closer and took off his glasses. I make movies in a studio not far from here, and I've got a job for you if you're interested. A job? What sort of a job? No more undercover agent, and I certainly wasn't going to wear a kangaroo suit ever again. My imagination kicked in. He wants me to be a movie star, I thought. My face would be on the cover of hundreds of magazines and I'd have a limousine all to myself. After what I have just seen, you would be perfect, he said. What did that mean? I had just been saved from man-eating panthers. Exactly what job did you have in mind? You'll love it, he said, smiling. What I need is a stuntman. The end.